Hello and welcome back to the Winning Agenda's Hero Spotlight series. My name's Jesse Muirman-Marshall, here for the Winning Agenda, and I've got a very exciting Hero Spotlight today, Fai Rising Rebellion. It's the last one of our Uprising Hero Spotlights, the third of three. We've been through Icelander, we've been through Dromai, and now we're here with Fai. This is a deck that we're going to have a deck tech coming out very soon as well with Isaac, who's of course a friend of the channel, who's been in several of our videos. And Isaac and I have been playing a particular Fai build that we've been adapting throughout Road to National season. So we'll talk you through that in some detail in the deck tech. But what I'm going to do today is give you a bit of a primer on the fundamentals of Fai. So whether you are someone who's newer to the game, who's looking to pick up a hero, or whether you're a more experienced player who's looking to explore what is undeniably one of the players in this new metagame, post-Starvo, post-Chain, this is the video for you. I'm going to try and run through all of the key cards, all of the key strategies, as we do in all of our hero spotlights, to give you an understanding and a jumping off point from which you can adapt and build your own Fai deck that suits your strategy and suits the way that you like to play, and hopefully find some success in some tournaments. So we'll dive straight in with, of course, the first thing that we do in every hero spotlight, which is to look at the hero ability itself. So Fai Rising Rebellion is a Draconic ninja hero with 4 intellect and 40 HP. Fai says you may start the game with a Phoenix Flame in your graveyard. Phoenix Flame, of course, was one of our preview cards. Thank you, LSS, for the opportunity to preview this and Heatwave. We really enjoyed that, and hopefully we'll see more preview cards for the upcoming sets as well. Phoenix Flame is a 0 cost, 0 power Draconic action, attack action. It has Go Again, and it says if you control 2 or more Draconic chain links, Phoenix Flame has +1 strength. So if you have 2 or more Draconic chain links, it's a 1 power attack for 0. So Phoenix Flame is a below rate card, right? So you might generally expect the rate that you'd see for a Go Again attack is sort of, particularly one that doesn't block, would be at least a 0 for 3 power. But here we're getting a 0 for 1 power, even if we meet the condition. But what Phoenix Flame does in combination with Fai is it gives us basically an extra portion of a card every single turn of the game. And we saw with things like Chain, or even in the reverse, things like Starvo, the decks that can reliably access card advantage in this game are going to be the decks that are the most successful in a competitive metagame. So we haven't seen a ninja deck that can as reliably access card advantage as what Fai can with its inbuilt hero ability. We do have to acknowledge, of course, that the card advantage that we're getting is a lower quality card. So Phoenix Flame is effectively not a full card in many senses because it's so below rate, but it can still, with the other synergies in the deck, become close to a full value of additional card per turn. And if LSS printed a hero, even one that had access to a slightly more underpowered card pool that had 5 printed intellect, that would be likely a very powerful hero to start with. So Fai is, I think, as close as we're going to see to that 5 intellect, at least in these first few years of the game. And it's really worth, because of that, because that inbuilt card advantage is just, as we know, so powerful in Flesh and Blood. It's really worth exploring how much can we get out of this free Phoenix Flame every turn within the card pool, and how much can we get out of Fai as a hero. How much can the addition of that 5th pseudo card to our hand per turn offset the fact that we're including some slightly less powerful cards in the Phoenix Flames in our deck. So the first way in which, of course, ninjas have traditionally been able to access card advantage and to overcome the fact that their cards tend to be a little more on the linear and perhaps weaker side individually is to make the sum of the parts more than the parts themselves. And the Mask of Momentum is one of the key ways we do that, by accessing card advantage for stringing together multiple pieces, no matter how powerful or insignificant they may be. The sort of death by 1,000 cuts concept, and the concept that if we are making multiple attacks, they are going to have a cumulative effect in how much damage they do to our opponent effectively by giving us access to an extra card. So Mask of Momentum is a key piece in the threat of the Fai deck, because it is a powerful on-hit trigger, which is going to be able to be applied to an attack action card every turn. So we'll run through Mask's effect because it is a little bit confusing, and I have seen a lot of people misquoting how it works and misidentifying how it works who aren't as familiar with it. So it's a once per turn effect. So you can't, even if you do multiple instances where this would trigger, it will only trigger once per turn. And it says when an attack action card you control is the third or higher chain link in a row to hit, draw a card. So it does present an on-hit draw trigger, which, as we know, very powerful in Fab, but it has to be an attack action card, it has to hit, and it has to be the third or higher chain link in a row to hit. So the first two chain links that hit don't have to be attack action cards. They can be Harmonized Kodachis or other attacks, but the attack that's going to trigger the mask has to be an attack action card. So in this row or series of attacks that hit, these multiple chain links in a row that are hitting, the one of them at least, at third or higher, has to be an attack action card for master trigger. So when you're sequencing your turns, you'll often find as a Fai player that you are sequencing things around mask triggers to try and present your opponent with a threat that is a bit awkward for them to block because it hits a breakpoint of 4, for example, which is hard for most decks to block with a single card. Or something that's hard for them to block with just the equipment that they have available at that time, so that they have to commit cards from hand. Because as soon as the ninja player, your threat of Mask of Momentum drawing you a card starts to strip cards from your opponent's hand, that's generally the place that you want to be in. So Mask of Momentum is one of those things that breaks up your opponent's ability to just sit there tanking and taking the damage that you're presenting and hoping that they can just come back at you with more. Mask of Momentum improves the calculation and the average amount of damage that you're going to be outputting per turn, just if your opponent decides to just take everything that you're putting out. So what you will find often is that opponents will try and disrupt your mask draw triggers to the extent that they can without giving up too many cards, whether it's by using equipment to, for instance, block the second Kodachi attack. When you're trying to string 3 things together, if they allow the first thing to hit, block the second one, then you have to sort of effectively start again. But one thing that we'll discover as we go through this Hero Spotlight is that Fai has the capacity, unlike Katsu a lot of the time, to string together 6 or 7 chain links quite regularly, which will allow Mask to be threatened more than one time per turn. So I wanted to run through Mask at the very beginning of this because I think it colors the way that we evaluate the rest of the cards in Fai. It's very important to the evaluation and the power and the status that we give to a lot of the cards that we consider including in our deck as to whether they work well with Mask and whether they are going to threaten those breakpoints that I mentioned if they are the third attack that we're threatening to hit in a row. The other option, though, in terms of masks, is Mask of the Pouncing Lynx. And this is one that we've seen in a lot of sideboards in Fai decks early on in the piece. It's another mask that is a block 2 blade break, similar to Mask of Momentum, but it doesn't stick around. So it's something that is destroyed to trigger its ability. So it says when an attack action card you control hits, doesn't have to be the third in a row, it can be just any attack action card that hits, you may destroy Mask of the Pouncing Lynx. If you do, search your deck for an attack action card with 2 or less power, banish it, then shuffle. You may play it this turn. So you can go and get multiple things which are relevant. You can get a finisher if you've had a long combat chain, or crucially, as we'll see coming up, you can go and get a Phoenix Flame to turn on your Phoenix form, for example, if you're going for more of a Phoenix form combo-oriented build. So Mask of the Pouncing Lynx is a toolbox. It may be that it emerges that it's more useful in a lot of the shorter games, because we do see against Runeblades, for example, against Briar or Viserai, the games only tend to last 3 or 4 turns, sometimes 5. Those Mask of Momentum triggers in those turns are important to force equipment blocks, but perhaps having Mask of the Pouncing Lynx is even more threatening on one particular big turn to try and turn the momentum of the game. So Mask of the Pouncing Lynx is just another option for card advantage rather than being a threat of card advantage every turn. It's an easier to trigger tutorable card advantage, not just the top card of your deck. You get to go and choose something and add it to your turn when it's most useful. So Mask of the Pouncing Lynx, something else to consider. The weapons are the other kind of key pieces. So of course, as we know with Fab, the equipment that you start the game with is very important because it dictates your game plan to some extent. So Mask of Momentum versus Mask of the Pouncing Lynx, very important for dictating your game plan. Similarly, Searing Emberblade versus double Harmonized Kodachi is a very important choice for Fai to make in every matchup. So I think a lot of decks at the moment are hedging and playing both of these as options. Searing Emberblade has the additional efficiency of outputting 3 damage for 2 resources, whereas the Harmonized Kodachis output 2 instances of 1. That's the main difference. The other difference, of course, is that Searing Emberblade is a Draconic attack, so it will get you closer to getting your Phoenix Flames back for free every turn, and it will trigger a lot of your other Draconic effects that rely on you having multiple Draconic chain links, things like Tome of Firebrand. Searing Emberblade, though, the downside of it, other than not having the 2 attacks for the purpose of Mask of Momentum, is that it doesn't have natural go again. Harmonized Kodachi, of course, doesn't have natural go again either, but with the deck construction, we can effectively give it go again as an opener by ensuring that all the blues we have in our deck are 0 cost, so that any blue we pitch will give the Harmonized Kodachis go again. So they can begin your turn, whereas Searing Emberblade can't, is one of the things to consider. But Searing Emberblade can be useful in those matchups where you think your opponent's unlikely to block any of your attacks, and you just want the raw efficiency of resources to damage. Searing Emberblade will be more effective, and in any deck that wants a lot of Draconic chain links, Searing Emberblade, of course, adds a more reliable extra Draconic chain link every turn. So those are sort of the trade-offs that you need to consider when you're deciding which of these weapons you want to go with. The next thing that's very important in a Fai deck is go again attacks to begin your combat chain. Katsu had a series of chain starters or openers. We had head jab, leg tap, and surging strike, whereas we've got Soaring Strike as the replacement for leg tap. It's the 1 cost. These are all 2 blocks, just like the Katsu openers. They all have an ability. So the Katsu openers didn't have an ability. They were vanilla, but then the subsequent combo attack comboed off them. So you sort of got that delayed ability on the second attack, whereas these openers that Fai gets all have a natural on-hit ability themselves, which is kind of cool, and they're Draconic. So Soaring Strike is the 1 cost. It says when Soaring Strike hits, you may banish attack action card from your hand with cost less than the number of Draconic chain links you control. If you do, it gains go again and you may play it this turn. So crucially, the card you banish has to have cost less than the number of Draconic chain links you control. But there are, of course, a lot of 0 cost attack action cards that you may want to banish with Soaring Strike to give them go again. So things like Snatch, Enlightened Strike, even Exude Confidence, could all be things that you want to consider banishing with this to give go again. Even Salt the Wound, for example, or Lava Burst. So there are lots of different options at 0 cost, which make Soaring Strike a pretty good opener, because even if you're opening with it and you can only banish 0 cost cards because you've only got 1 Draconic chain link at that point, there are lots of really good targets for it. So it's a 1 for 4 go again, and it's something that I've found to be a reasonably efficient and useful card. The second one that's quite good is Rising Resentment. So this is a 0 for 3. It's the head jab replacement. It's got an ability that says when Rising Resentment hits, you may banish an attack action card from your hand with cost less than the number of Draconic chain links you control. If you do, it costs a resource less to play, and you may play it this turn. So the problem with Rising Resentment is, in terms of its ability, is that it's best when it's not the first Draconic chain link, because if it's the first Draconic chain link, you can only banish 0 costs, and then the cost reduction doesn't really matter. Unless, of course, you're against Frostbites, because I think the way that rules interaction works is that if you attack with Rising Resentment, and then you're given a Frostbite by Icelander, for example, if you open with Rising Resentment, Icelander plays an ice card from Arsenal, gives you a Frostbite, you can then banish, if this hits, you can banish a card from your hand with cost 0 and play it for free. I think that's how that works. Someone can correct me in the comments, but I think that's the way the addition of a cost and then subtraction of a cost works. But otherwise, the main use case for Rising Resentment's cost reduction ability is that if it's the second or higher Draconic chain link, you can start banishing 1 or 2 cost cards from your hand and giving them a resource discount, which is a pretty cool little extra ability for one of your go again openers to have. But at a base, Rising Resentment is basically a reasonably efficient 0 for 3 Draconic opener that can contribute to your 3 that you need to return your Phoenix Flame for free each turn. Ronin Renegade similarly is a Rising Resentment without the additional ability. It's just a 0 for 3 block 2 that is Draconic and has Go Again. Brand with Cinderclaw is another one of the 0 for 3 Draconic attacks. It's got 2 block as well, but it's got this actually very useful ability, particularly in the Harmonized Kodachi build, where it says your next attack this combat chain is Draconic in addition to its other card types. So it doesn't have to be an attack action card, it can be an attack, and so that includes weapon attacks. So Harmonized Kodachi, if you go Brand with Cinderclaw first, and then attack with the Kodachi will become Draconic. And if we're looking at Fai's hero ability, that effectively means you gain a resource just by playing this in effect a lot of the time. So you play this, you then attack with your Kodachi, and the difference between the Kodachi being non-Draconic or Draconic is a 1 resource discount on your Fai hero ability. So that's quite significant, and it's quite a significant bonus to get from something that already has decent base stats. So Brand with Cinderclaw is something I'm usually happy to play at red and at blue as one of my 0 cost blues to turn on my Kodachis in a Kodachi build, and sometimes even at yellow as well. Mounting Anger is a 1 for 4 at red. It says, when Mounting Anger hits, you may banish an attack action card from your hand with cost less than the number of Draconic chainlinks you control. If you do, it gains +1 strength and you may play it this turn. Go again. So this is similar to Soaring Strike. We've got exactly the same stats as Soaring Strike, but we're giving a 1 damage buff to any 0 costs. So Mounting Anger perhaps has more hits in an average Fai deck and Fai turn than what Soaring Strike does, but Soaring Strike's ability to give Go Again to things like Snatch or an Enlightened Strike may turn out to be more valuable some of the time than just the +1 strength. But the fact that Mounting Anger hits more consistently, in terms of on more turns you're going to be able to trigger Mounting Anger's ability, possibly makes it a better include than Soaring Strike. But it's certainly an interesting one, and the ability to turn, for Mask of Momentum reasons, for just the reasons of additional damage is useful in an aggro deck. The ability to turn your 0 for 3s into 0 for 4s is pretty strong. So Mounting Anger definitely worth considering. Spreading Flames is a 1 for 3, so it's blocks 2, so it's weaker than Mounting Anger and Soaring Strike in terms of base stats. But Spreading Flames is, I think, one of the more powerful openers that Fai can have. It says Draconic attacks you control have +1 strength, while their base strength is less than the number of Draconic chainlinks you control. So in order for something to be buffed, it needs to have less base strength than the number of Draconic chainlinks. So if it's the second Draconic chainlink, it needs to have strength 1, so on and so forth. But Spreading Flames, if you do structure your turns right, can actually get quite a number of buffs in a Fai turn. And when you combine it with something like Stubby Hammerers or Art of War, you can start to see your Phoenix Flames becoming 0 for 3s, even 0 for 4s. So Spreading Flames can be the core of some of your really big turns in Fai, and it's something that's definitely worth including, I think, in just about any Fai deck that you put together. Belittle, featuring our good friend Dom Z here, top 4 at the recent Sydney Calling, and it has been noted by locals, has a few resemblances to the Belittle guy. Is a very good include here in the Fai deck because it is a way for you to get access to another 0 cost blue. So of course going and fetching a blue minnowism is, if you start with a Belittle off a tunic counter, or even off pitching a red in a pinch, or even pitching another blue, you pitch a blue, come with Belittle, go and get a second blue in minnowism for free. Then you've got 2 more Kodachi attacks or a Searing Emberblade attack off your first blue you've pitched, and then you've still got another 3 resources off your free minnowism to pay for your Mounting Angers, Soaring Strikes, various other things as well. Or if you're playing post board and you've brought in some 2 cost 6 power attacks, the Belittle can help you more reliably finish your turn with an Erase Face or a Command and Conquer, some of those more expensive resource hungry cards, and it does smooth out your resource curve of your deck a little bit more. So Belittle's one that I've really enjoyed having in the Fai decks as well. It's not Draconic is the downside, so it's not going to contribute to Draconic chainlinks for your Phoenix Flame. It's not going to get buffed by things like Spreading Flames, but its power is just so high in terms of getting that additional card and those additional resources that I think it's worth an include. Double Strike is another opener. It's, again, not a Draconic opener. This is a generic ninja opener. And it's something that, again, works very well with Mask of Momentum, works very well with Stubby Hammerers, works very well with Art of War, these things that are going to give you buffs across your turn that don't care about Draconic or not Draconic. So if you're heading more towards a build that's not quite so dependent on the Draconic keyword and the synergies there, then Double Strike can be a good one to include because, as I said, it does synergize very well, much like the Kodachis with the 2 attacks, giving you 2 chances to get hits, which will then contribute to your block of 3 that you need for Mask of Momentum. And just getting the opportunity, as I said, to get buffed twice by Stubby Hammerers, twice by Art of War, means this can contribute to some very big turns as well. So the next aspect is mid-chain combos. So those are all the things that you can start your chain with. Of course, they can go in the middle of the chain as well. But these are cards that can't begin the chain as well as those ones that we just discussed, but they perhaps have a little bit more power because of that. And they hit a little bit harder. So to start with, we've got Flamecall Awakening. So this is an excellent source of card advantage, just like Belittle. It's a way to access another card for free. So, the blue minnowism that you'll often go and fetch with your Belittle isn't necessarily very powerful, but it fulfills a role in that it's more resources for you. Similarly, the Phoenix Flame that you go and fetch with your Flamecall Awakening, not particularly powerful, as we discussed earlier, necessarily in isolation, but it fulfills a role. And if you are on a Spreading Flames turn, if you're on a Spreading Flames Art of War Stubby Hammerers turn, that extra Phoenix Flame can be an extra 3, an extra 4 damage. And if you're on a Phoenix Form turn, then that extra Phoenix Flame can be really massive. So Flamecall Awakening is a fixer, if you like. It gets you itself and another Draconic attack if you can trigger its ability by having played another red before it. And in the middle of the chain, it's just very, very powerful. Again, 2 separate attacks for Mask of Momentum. It's just got a lot going for it. So I'm a big fan of Flamecall Awakening. Inflame is another one that I think is not as powerful as Flamecall Awakening, but has similar potential to give you multiple Draconic chain links, multiple chain links hitting for Mask of Momentum, and multiple ways to get buffed by Stubby Hammerers, Art of War, Spreading Flames, etc. So Inflame says, when you attack with Inflame, if you've played another red card this turn, you may return a Phoenix Flame from your graveyard to your hand. So unlike Flamecall Awakening, which searches through your deck for a Phoenix Flame, Inflame requires you to have 1 in your graveyard. Of course, you start with 1 in your graveyard from Fai, but when you haven't got the second 1 in your graveyard, it's less appealing to be playing Inflame on those turns because you likely already have the ability to recur that 1 Phoenix Flame that's in there, just with Fai's natural hero ability. So Inflame really shines when you've got at least 2 Phoenix Flames in your graveyard. So it's probably not something, even if you do put it in your deck, that you want to have 3 of, but it might be a 1 or a 2 of to get that additional chain link and that sort of additional card later on in the game once you've got 2 or more Phoenix Flames in your graveyard. It is below rate even when you get back a Phoenix Flame if you don't have a synergistic turn. So if you're not Art of War, Spreading Flames, Stubby Hammerizing, Inflame is obviously, even when you've got the additional Phoenix Flame, still only threatening 2 damage off 1 card, which is sort of below where you want to be. But as we've seen, and as we'll continue to see, there are enough ways that you can turn this into more than that 2 damage, and you can start multiplying that 2, that it is one definitely worth considering. Blaze Headlong is just one with great stats. It's Scar for a Scar, if you like, but rather than needing to be on less life, you just have to have played another red card this turn. And unlike Scar for a Scar, it is Draconic, so it's going to work with Fai's hero ability. It's another chain link, and it's just got those great base stats of 0 for 4. So this is, I think, a mainstay of most Fai decks. Lava Vein Loyalty is one that I do like having at blue and sometimes at red. Actually, I think the blue might even be better than the red. So it's a 0-cost Draconic attack. It says if you control 2 or more Draconic chain links, it has Go Again. The blue attacks for 1, the red attacks for 3, but crucially it also blocks for 3. So it's one of those elusive 0-cost blues that blocks for 3, that's ninja. It's also Draconic, and it's got a relevant ability to get Go Again. But yeah, it's one of those cards that's definitely worth considering including in your Fai deck as one of your blue resources, particularly if you're playing the Kodachi build. If you're playing the If you're leaning more into Emberblade, then Lava Vein Loyalty becomes less appealing because there are some non-zero cost blue options that are perhaps a little bit more powerful, like Flying Kick. Phoenix Form is another one that will come in the middle or at the end of your chains and threaten sometimes some very powerful plays. So I had the amazing experience of going off turn 0 with Phoenix Flame when an opponent who was playing Dromai pitched into Quell with their reds early on in the turn, and I was able to string together 3 Phoenix Flames into a Phoenix Form, and then draw 3 cards, draw another Phoenix Form, and then drew 3 more cards. So I ended up with 6 cards in hand and my opponent out of cards on turn 0. So that was very exciting. Doesn't happen all that often, probably never happen again in my life. But merely just the upside that you can get from something that threatens to draw 3 cards on hit, albeit very conditionally, is worth considering. You do sometimes need to do a little bit of building around to make this more consistent, if you like, by including things like Inflame in your deck. But I think even if you're just playing Flamecall Awakening, the likelihood that you're going to be able to string together 2 Phoenix Flames on a turn becomes higher. And then this is, more consistently a 0 for 5 go again that blocks for 3. And that's not too bad at all. So Phoenix Flame, definitely worth thinking about. It may turn out to be a little bit too inconsistent compared to some of the other great options. There are a wealth of options for Fai. But at the moment, I'm enjoying slotting 3 of them and sometimes seeing the magic happen. Enlightened Strike, similarly, is another 0 cost, efficient attack. It's been in a lot of top decks over the course of Fab history. It may not be, because it lacks Draconic and because it is a little bit more card hungry, it may not be one that ends up making it into the top builds. But I think the synergy with Soaring Strike is worth considering, that if you do hit with a Soaring Strike and then banish this, you can give this then go again, which then you can choose the draw a card mode and have a efficient go again attack that's drawing a card and getting rid of the worst card in your hand. It is just a little bit awkward sometimes to have Enlightened Strike because it's not such a great opener in Fai, it's not Draconic, doesn't help you with your hero ability, all those things. But there are definitely a few synergies that are worth considering, and as we know, its base power is pretty high. So other than those mid-chain cards and the things that you won't open with necessarily, but you'll have in the middle of your chain and that will enable you to continue your attacks, these are the Coup de Grace cards, the ones that are going to finish your chain, or at least most of the time are going to be finishes that you might want to Snapdragon sometimes, or you might Soaring Strike sometimes, but don't naturally have go again. So the first one is Lava Burst. It's the nature of its Coup de Grace is that it's just giving you a really efficient attack. So if you play it at Chainlink 4 or higher, which is very easy to do if you've got Kodachis or double strikes or anything else in your deck, or even just with Fai's natural hero ability, it gets +3 strength and becomes a 0 for 5. It also blocks for 3, which is nice. But basically this is just a card that's going to reward you for doing what you want to do, which is build wide combat chains, by giving you a very hyper efficient 0 for 5 attack. Breaking Point is a 1 for 5 that also threatens to, if you fulfill the Rupture keyword, destroy all cards in your opponent's arsenal. So very good against Lexis that are trying to build up a 6-card hand, but also very good just against any deck that wants to build up a 5-card hand like a Briar or a Viserai, particularly those aggro decks that aren't going to want to be blocking you and are going to want to just try and come back over the top of you. Presenting a Breaking Point means that they can't do that as effectively, and that the math of that becomes a lot harder for them. So it is an important card, I think, to have available in your sideboard or your main deck if you are expecting a lot of Rune Blades, and it is, I think, still good against Lexi, even with the threat of some of the ice cards, because having these ways to turn the momentum when you are able to find your opening when Lexi has an off turn, to actually really threaten them and stop them building towards their next turn, whether it's a 3-of-a-kind turn or some other 6-card hand. Breaking Point just allows you to sort of cement that tempo advantage. Snatch is an ever-present card in a lot of these aggro decks. It's a powerful way to end your combat chain. It's a powerful threat to present after multiple other threats, and it's a great target for Snapdragon Scalers, of course, if it is unblocked. There's not much else to say about Snatch. It's pretty self-explanatory, but it's card advantage that it offers and the maths that it gives you by giving you effectively an arsenal where you might not have one, or threatening to give you an arsenal where you might not otherwise have one, is a very good threat to have. Rise Up is one that hasn't necessarily found as much of a home in competitive decks yet. It's another card that combos off Phoenix Flames, so it's a 1-cost specialization. It's got 3 power and 3 block. It's got a Rupture ability as well. If Rise Up is played as Chainlink 4 or higher, it has Dominate and plus X power, where X is twice the number of Phoenix Flames you control. So you control Phoenix Flames if they're on the combat chain, so you have to have played them that turn already. And twice the number is the buff. So if you control one Phoenix Flame, so if you played 1 Phoenix Flame this turn, this is a 1 for 5 with Dominate. And if you've played 2 Phoenix Flames this turn, it's a 1 for 7. So as a 1 for 5 Dominate, it's not quite good enough. I don't think that's powerful enough without any on-hit ability to be playable. But if you can reliably be making this a 1 for 7, then I think it probably is good enough to think about playing. It's just going to be a matter of evaluating and playtesting with your deck, testing out your metagame, and trying to get a sense of how often is this a 1 for 7. And is a 1 for 7 even good enough? Is that even better than a Breaking Point? Because a Breaking Point is a 1 for 5, but perhaps the ability to, or the threat of destroying the arsenal is worth more than the additional 2 damage and the Dominate. Salt the Wound is another one. It's got a lot of really good attributes for the things that we've already talked about that we're looking for. It's a 0 cost attack, so it's going to work with Kodachis. It's a yellow, so it's going to pay for 2 Kodachis. It blocks for 3. It's a 2 power attack, so it can be revealed to Belittle. And it says Salt the Wound gains +1 strength for each attack that has hit this combat chain. It's also the 2 powers worth mentioning can be tutored up by Mask of the Pouncing Lynx, which means that if you are playing the Mask of the Pouncing Lynx and you have a particularly big turn where your opponent doesn't block, you can perhaps go and fetch Assault the Wound, which might have, +4 or +5 and be a 0 for 7 to finish off that chain, which can be obviously a powerful additional piece of tempo for you to throw into the mix in some of those aggro mirrors. But Salt the Wound's one that I haven't necessarily found myself playing all that much, as in actually casting it or attacking with it, but it is one that I have often used for the block mode because it does block well, or for the pitch mode because it also pitches pretty well as a yellow, and it does give you a little bit of versatility sometimes, although lacking that on-hit again, just like Rise Up, is something that sometimes makes it feel a little bit clunky. And Take the Tempo is another one that does have an on-hit that's sort of clunky in different ways. So it costs 1, which is a bit annoying. It only pitches for red, but it does block 3 and attacks for 5, so decent stats. And it has an on-hit. So it says, when Take the Tempo hits, if you've hit 3 or more times this combat chain, banish the top card of your deck. If it's an attack action card, you may play it until the end of your next turn. So if this is the 3rd thing in your turn to hit, it doesn't have to be in a row. You kind of hit with, 2 Kodachis or a Kodachi and a Phoenix Flame at some point, and then you hit with this. You then get to banish the top card of your deck, and if it's an attack action card, you can play it till the end of your next turn. So this can whiff if it hits an Art of War, if it hits an Ancestral Empowerment or anything else that's not an attack action card, it will be a whiff. But assuming that it does hit, the ability to basically draw a card, but in some ways better than draw a card, because if you do have an arsenal after playing this, and you get to banish the top card of your deck, then you can go into the next turn with effectively a 6-card hand. So there's something to be said for Take the Tempo and the potential that it offers. But at the moment, I haven't been testing it all that much, but it's one of those things that I keep having as something that I want to get into my decks, but just haven't yet. So buffs and tricks, I've mentioned a few of these throughout the video so far. Uprising is one that I did have in my initial builds and has fallen out of favor a bit, mainly because it's not an attack. It's a non-attack action, so if you draw it in the middle of your turn, you can't play it. You have to start with it because otherwise you'll break your combat chain, which tends to be pretty bad for Fai. Your next 4 Draconic attacks this turn gain +1. So again, it only works on Draconic attacks, which is okay. It buffs your Phoenix Flames, it buffs your Spreading Flames and all your other openers and things. But there are some attacks that I've been wanting to play in these decks, things like Double Strike, Belittle, etc., which don't get the buff. And I found that sometimes I wasn't using up all 4 of the buffs, at which point this isn't the best thing to have in your deck. So I've sort of landed at the point where I'm playing more attacks instead. But that may change if I end up reverting to more of a Phoenix Flame oriented build or one with more things like Inflame in it. It's definitely a role play that's worth considering. Ancestral Empowerment is as close to or it's just another piece of card advantage basically that you can get. It blocks for 3, it's an attack reaction, it only targets ninja attack actions, so the more draconic non-ninja attack actions you're playing, things like Flamecall Awakening and Blaze Headlong, Ancestral Empowerment does lose a little bit of power, but the fact that you can buff your 3rd attack in a row that you're threatening the mask to hit and potentially get it over the top of their exact blocks means that it's just a threat that really gets in your opponent's head and mucks with their blocks a little bit. And it's also something that then, if you do use it, obviously for that amazing scenario of getting your mask-threatening attack over their block, getting the draw trigger off the mask, and then drawing a card off the Ancestral Empowerment as well, you can fuel a much bigger turn than you otherwise might have been able to if you just had, a handful of attack actions that were sort of heads up, so to speak. So Ancestral Empowerment, I think, is a more powerful card than it might look, and it's definitely worth thinking about in these Fai decks. Art of War, similarly, is a good way to sneakily buff and get your attack over the top of your opponent's blocks. If you pitch a blue and you go Kodachi, Ronin Renegade or Rising Resentment, they take the 2 Kodachis and then they try to put a 3 block in front of the Rising Resentment and you use your last resource to Art of War. That's an amazing turn. So it can be very good. It can also be a little bit clunky sometimes, but it's definitely an amazing threat to have, just like Ancestral Empowerment, at helping you get those mask triggers and break some of the predictability that your deck might otherwise have. So in the Aggro Mirrors, it's worth thinking about ways that you can try and break down, as I said, that predictability, but also gain incremental advantage against decks that aren't looking to block you, and where you're not looking to block as well, because you're wanting to hold as many cards in hand as possible. So Stoke the Flames is one. It's a 1-cost 4-power attack. It blocks for 3. It says, when Stoke the Flames hits, you may return a Phoenix Flame from your graveyard to your hand. If you do, Stoke the Flames gains Go Again, which can be a very powerful way to extend your turn. So again, this is a 1-for-4 attack, which is not a terrible rate. 1-for-4 with Go Again, not that bad, but it's conditional Go Again, so it has to hit. But again, if we're in a matchup where the opponent is incentivized not to block, because they're, Briar or Viserai, and the more cards in hand they hold, the more synergy they have, the more damage they can output. If we're able to break up their hand by forcing them to block something like a Stoke the Flames, then that's already a mini victory. So if we're assuming that we're in our opponent's seat and they're evaluating whether this is worth blocking, the on-hit ability can be quite relevant a lot of the time. Like in Flame, it requires you to have 2 Phoenix Flames in the graveyard before it starts being, its most powerful, because otherwise you're sort of bouncing the one to your hand that you would otherwise bring back with Fai's ability, and that's not really giving you that much advantage. But once you do have the 2 in the graveyard, the ability to get another one of them back, give this Go Again, and be throwing another attack, which might be another mask trigger that you're threatening, if they've managed to break up your first lot of 3, or something else to get buffed by Stubby Hammerers, Art of War, Spreading Flames, and so on, means that your turns can get quite big. So Stoke the Flames is just another on-hit trigger that you might want to consider, and of course it's another Draconic attack itself. That All You Got is a really good way to break up the basic math of trading blows in those aggro mirror matches, and even in the Fai mirror itself. So it's a 0-cost defense reaction that blocks for 3, and it says, while this is defending an attack with 2 or less power, when the combat chain closes, draw a card. So crucially, the attack still has to have 2 power when the combat chain closes, so if they buff it later in the combat chain, or if they buff it in response to you playing That All You Got, then you won't get to draw your card. But as long as it's blocking one of those small attacks, whether it's a Harmonized Kodachi or a Rosetta Thorn or a Phoenix Flame, then you're going to get to save some damage and then draw a card back to replace this, which is pretty amazing, as we've seen in Fab. This is sort of similar in many ways to Ancestral Empowerment, if you want to think about it that way. Obviously, it doesn't have all of the same synergies as Ancestral Empowerment does with Mask, but the ability to have an intervention into combat that then replaces itself is very, very powerful. So I really like That All You Got. It's one of the cards that's felt the most powerful for me when I've drawn it and had it. Of course, it's also a 0 cost that pitches for 2, which synergizes very well with Kodachis too. Engulfing Flamewave is another one worth considering in the Aggro Mirrors. It's another one of the Fai openers, or the Draconic openers, if you like, in this set. It costs 2, which is reasonably significant. But if we do have a slightly higher number of blues or yellows in our deck, or if we're playing Belittle and we're expecting to have a few more resources around from those Minnowisms, then Engulfing Flamewave becomes a little bit more appealing and likely to be able to be castable. And the on-hit ability is quite relevant and quite powerful. So it says, when Engulfing Flamewave hits, reveal the top card of your deck. If it's an attack action card with cost less than the number of Draconic chainlinks you control, banish it. You may play it this turn. And it has Go Again. So it's a lot like Take the Tempo, but unlike Take the Tempo, which doesn't have Go Again, this has Go Again, and it lets you play that card this turn, but it doesn't give you the ability like Take the Tempo to play it the following turn. So Engulfing Flamewave synergizes very well with all of the Coup de Grace cards that I mentioned earlier, because if you have one of them on top of your deck and you banish it with this, then you can use that to finish the turn, and you've drawn a powerful card, a powerful finisher for free. It also works very well with all the openers that are cheap, and it works very well with all the mid-chain cards as well, that most of which cost 0 or 1. So I think Engulfing Flamewave, if you can get it to hit, is very powerful, which means that, again, in matchups where your opponent's incentivized not to block, it makes a lot of sense to have these powerful on-hit abilities in your deck. But the 2 cost is somewhat restrictive, so it needs to be balanced against that as well. Erase Face, another 2 cost attack. It's a good one out of the sideboard. Blocks for 2, but crucially has 6 power. So it's going to pop dragons, pop other phantasm attacks, and it's got a very relevant on-hit ability, which is particularly devastating against Viserai and very good against Lexi as well. It says, when it hits a hero, cards and tokens they control, they own, lose all class and talent types until their next turn, till the end of their next turn, I should say. So it stops all of Viserai's cards from being Runeblade cards, which means they can't trigger Viserai's hero ability to generate rune chance. They can't get Go Again from Morven Skies, very crucially, and they won't get buffed by Mordred Tide. So, as in the Viserai rune chant generation won't get buffed by Mordred Tide. So Erase Face is very powerful against Viserai, and it's one that is basically a must block for Viserai in that matchup. This Rounds on Me is also one that's worth mentioning. It's potentially good in the Fai mirror, negating Harmonized Kodachis in particular, but also Phoenix Flames. But of course, it's always dangerous to give your opponent a card, and less good if you're playing Kodachis yourself. But because it's not a 0 cost for the Kodachis to give them Go Again. But I could see in a Searing Emberblade build, or one that's more focused on Emberblades, that this could become something that's a powerful tool out of the sideboard. I haven't tried it myself, but it's certainly something that's been floating around as an option. So card advantage is one of the last things we're going to look at. We're already running pretty long on time, so we'll try and wrap it up soon. Some card advantage cards, I've already talked about most of them, but Tome of the Firebrand is one that I've just mentioned briefly. It's a 1 cost instant. You can only play it if you control 4 or more Draconic chain links. So very restrictive. But if you think about, you basically need to get to 3, and then you've got the free one in your graveyard, being the Phoenix Flame. So can you string together 3 Draconic chain links? You then think, well, I've got a weapon, Searing Emberblade. So if you are playing a Searing Emberblade build, you basically just need 2 other Draconic cards on your turn, and then you can cast your Tome of Firebrand. So I think that's probably consistent enough. It's probably achievable enough consistently that it's worth considering the power of a 1 cost draw 2 that is instant, so it doesn't take up an action point, and also doesn't break the combat chain. So Tome of Firebrand, very powerful. Art of War fulfills somewhat of a similar role, though it's not as clean in the card advantage side. But its other applications mean that it probably gets the nod over Tome of Firebrand a lot of the time, and you probably can't afford to play, 4, 5, or 6 copies of instants that don't block and unattacks themselves, and particularly with Tome of Firebrand that needs lots of other things to have happened before you're able to play it. So it's kind of got a bit of anti-synergy with Art of War in that way, because if you draw them together in the same hand, you can have a brick hand. But yeah, I think it's worth playing around with and worth considering because its power level is just so high, and it does work very well with Fai's hero ability and card pool. Snatch is another source of card advantage we've mentioned. Take the tempo as well. That all you got. The card advantage I mentioned there of being able to have an intervention in combat that then replaces itself. Ancestral Empowerment, another intervention into combat that is card neutral, so you're just getting that intervention effectively for free. And Art of War as well, which in totality, even though it's can appear to be card neutral because you're paying a resource and the Art of War itself, and then the card you're banishing to replace with 2 cards, so you're playing a resource and 2 cards to get back 2 cards, the question then is, are you willing to pay 1 resource to give all your attacks +1, or your attack action cards +1 for the turn? The answer is most of the time yes. That's a pretty good trade. 1 resource and 0 cards to give all your attack action cards +1 for the turn. That's something that you're normally going to take. So when I say card advantage, it may not strictly be card advantage, but it's just a very efficient ability to give a buff to your entire turn and cycle a few cards out. So Art of War, definitely a good one in Fai. Mask of Momentum, of course, is the last source of card advantage and the most important, which we talked about at the top, because it's there ever present on the board, threatening your opponent if they don't block correctly. Resources I'll just touch on very quickly. These are the 0 cost and other blues that are worth considering. Flying Kick, if you're in more of an Emberblade build, very efficient. It's a 2 for 5. You're going to get to Chainlink 3 or higher very often. So 2 for 5 at blue that blocks for 3, very serviceable. Happy to put that in the deck. Soulbead Strike is a 0 cost blue that blocks for 3 and has a semi-relevant ability. So it gets the nod over things like Rising Knee Thrust that are effectively blank in this deck. Blood of the Drakai gives us in decks that are playing more 1s and more 2 cost things. Blood of the Drakai does help because it's going to, give us a few extra resources. Minnowism, the next attack action card with 3 or less base power you play this turn gains +1. Not the most powerful effect, but of course we get it for free off the Belittles, so we're pretty happy to play that. And then onto the sideboard. So Thor, just a 6 power that you can pop Phantasms with that will also help incrementally in the Lexi and Icelander matchups. Command and Conquer has lost a little bit of steam recently, mostly because of Crown of Providence and also perhaps some of the aggro mirrors where your opponent's going to be arsenaling less. Command and Conquer has lost a little bit of value because of that, but it's still a powerful card. Erase Face, very good in the Viserai match, good in the Lexi match, stops them fusing. Some people play it in the Fai mirror. I'm not convinced about that, but it's certainly got some application in turning off Fai's hero ability. That All You Got, also a good one, of course, as I mentioned, to have in the sideboard. So lastly, we'll just run through the equipment quickly. Mask of Momentum, Mask of the Pouncing Lynx we've discussed. Flamescale Furnace can be good in the mirror. I personally still like to play Tunic a lot of the time in the mirror. Just getting that free resource for your Belittle, for your Art of War is really nice. But I can also see the appeal of Flamescale Furnace if you are pretty sure your opponent's playing Kodachis, or even just against key Phoenix Flames, being able to hold your 4 cards in hand and deny them their Mask of Momentum trigger can be really huge. Then we've got Stubby Hammerers, which I've mentioned a few times, can be part, especially in combination with Spreading Flames and Art of War, of some pretty big buffs to your whole turn. It buffs all attack action cards with 3 or less base power, which of course affects Phoenix Flames as well as most of the other attacks in the deck. And then Tiger Stripe Shuko is another option in that slot if we do want to block, or a piece of equipment that blocks on the arms. It also buffs the second attack action card with 2 or less base power each turn by +1 and says the damage that would be dealt by it can't be prevented, which is not an ability that comes up a lot, but it does matter against things like Spectral Shields and some other abilities as well. And then Snapdragon Scalers in the boot slot. So that's all for the Fai Hero Spotlight. It was a lot to race through. Been playing a lot of Fai. I've had a lot of thoughts about it, and I hope that's been helpful. If you've got any thoughts or anything you would like to share from your experiences playing Fai, or anything that you'd like to see in future Hero Spotlights, please let us know. We'll be back with a deck tech with Fai very soon, and then a bit of coverage of the post-Road to Nationals, possibly some draft primers and things like that as we move towards the National Championships. Thanks for tuning in. I've been Jesse Muirman-Marsh, I should say, for the Winning Agenda. I'll see you next time. Thanks a lot.